I'm from Monash University, and this talk is pretty much part of our ongoing work on applying information theory to study certain aspects of protein architecture and structure. So my co-authors on this work are my colleague Lloyd Allison, who's in the audience hiding his face away in that corner, and Arthur Lesk from Penn State. So the motivation behind the work was primarily to understand the descriptive complexity of protein structures. In other words, we want to understand how much information a single protein structure contains. The reason for us to do this is by doing this, we ask the next question: what would be the information content of a collection of protein structures? Let's say, for example, in the protein data bank. A more applied focus of this work would be we are interested in concise representations that capture the essence of protein folding patterns. And secondary structural assignment is very crucial in capturing that essence. So in that sense, we wanted to use information theory to give a secondary structural description to protein coordinates and then move on to concise representations. Now, the major framework behind our work uses the criterion of minimum message length, which I'll abbreviate to MML, which is abbreviated as MML. It was introduced by this distinguished professor, Chris Wallace, who founded the department where I work at, way back in 1968, really pioneering work that appeared in Computer Journal. And the broad essence is it is a model selection paradigm, criterion that links data compression to statistical inductive inference. While I'm going to give you a very broad 100,000 feet view of MML, for this resource, the book that he wrote is an excellent resource for people who are interested in this kind of framework. Now, MML is Bayesian. Bayes' theorem says, as most of you will know, the joint probability of hypothesis and the data is equivalent to the prior on the hypothesis times the likelihood, the probability of data given the hypothesis. It's same as saying it's a prior on the data times prior on the data times the posterior. Now, almost independently, Shannon, in his mathematical theory of communication, gave this insight that if you have an event E whose probability is P of E, then the optimal code to represent that event would be negative log of that probability. Now, if you apply Shannon's insight to Bayes, you get the Bayes' theorem's restatement in information theoretic terms. So the information in hypothesis in the data is equivalent to information of the hypothesis plus the information in the data given the hypothesis. What it does is it allows you to compare two competing hypotheses. So you have a hypothesis H and an H prime. You can compare the posteriors, and then that's the equation on the right hand side. Now, if you are able to compare two hypotheses, in principle, you should be able to search for the best hypothesis. And let's see how MML frames this. You could view MML is best understood as a communication process between a hypothetical transmitter and a hypothetical receiver connected over a Shannon channel. The goal for the transmitter is to transmit the observed data, whatever it might be, to the receiver losslessly. So they shouldn't lose any information. Exact data has to be transmitted, and it has to be encoded as a part of a message. Before that any transmission is done, before any transmission is done, they agree upon a code book, a common rules of communication, and a code book should not contain anything more than universal truths about the data or the preconceived notions about hypothetical data, not the data that's precisely being transmitted. Now, anything that's not a part of the code book has to be transmitted as a message. The transmission can be thought of as a two-part message. The first part is an assertion. The transmitter says, he or she says it's there's such and such hypothesis on the data, and that transmission takes a certain number of bits, and then once the receiver receives the hypothesis, transmitter gives the details that are not explained by the theory, by the assertion, and those take a certain number of bits. The objective is to find the hypothesis that minimizes the two-part message length. Now, jumping into our work, I'm going to use, so the work has a lot of gory details. I'm only capturing the insight. If the technical details are not clear, I'm quite happy to speak to you offline. But I'll be using some small notations during the talk. I'll use P1, P2, P3, and so on to mean the C alpha coordinates starting from the N terminus to C terminus. Protein coordinates that coordinates that come in the PDB format are stated to 3 places after the decimal point, each component x, y, z coordinate. That's not the experimental accuracy, but because we are treating this to be a lossless transmission, we treat that the accuracy of we pretend that the accuracy of measurement is 0.001 angstrom, so that the transmitter can transmit the 3 precisely the way he sees it in the PDB file. Only the C alpha coordinates though. Now, what I find interesting is it sets a natural null hypothesis. The natural null hypothesis is you could state the coordinates raw meaning as is. By as is, you're not sending it in ASCII. It's a very bad encoding. You still have to make an effort to send it in a good encoding scheme. So let's see what a null model message for for transmitting coordinate data would entail. Pretend as if the transmitter has already transmitted points until P of I minus 1. He has to transmit the next C alpha coordinate P of I. He first transmits the distance r between I and I minus 1 over a probability distribution, precisely a normal distribution whose mean is 3.8 angstroms because there's a big constraint between successive C alphas, and the sigma, a very small sigma associated with it, 0.2 angstroms. So when he sends r over a probability distribution, the idea is that for the values that are closer, it's a variable length encoding. The values that are closer to the mean, you have a shorter message length. For the values that deviate from the mean, it's a larger message length. It turns out that once the R is transmitted to the receiver only knows, he has Pi minus 1, he knows that R lies anywhere on a sphere of radius R. Okay? So a transmitter then has to send further information. He discretizes this sphere around with the Pi minus 1 as a center, and he discretizes the surface of the sphere into cells of area epsilon squared, which are epsilon being the accuracy of measurement. So the general idea is if you agree on the numbering of this discretization, the transmitter only has to send the number as an integer code, and then the receiver would basically reconstruct the cell and use the center of the cell as a prediction for that thing, and that has to agree to because it's been discretized to epsilon squared. He would be able to get precisely the data that's being sent to 0.001 accuracy. Now, that was the null model message is done incrementally if you keep doing it one point after another. Now, coming to the secondary structural hypothesis, how do you send the coordinates using the secondary structural hypothesis, secondary structures as hypothesis? It turns out that you basically can define, so in any secondary structural assignment would define the start and end points of each secondary structural element will define a hypothesis on the segment. You're transmitting the segment over that hypothesis. The search problem would be to find the best secondary structural assignment that explains the data. So let's now go through how you explain segments using secondary structural hypothesis. We consider broadly 2 types of models. The first model would be the coil model. The coil model assumes that there's structures have disordered regions that you can't compress, they're unstructured, so you can't do better than stating these segments raw. I'm just stating the language of communication, the search is a different problem. So you state, let's say there's a segment Pi to Pj, which needs to be stated as a null model message. Then you state Pi plus 1 given Pi, Pi plus 2 given Pi plus 1, so on till Pj, using the sphere approach that we just saw in the previous slides. Now, there are you have helices and strands in that manifest in protein structures. We use the ideal line or ideal models for various types of helices, alpha, 310, pi, and you use an extended ideal extended strand, and by ideal I mean models that follow the Pauling-Corey geometry, the Pauling-Corey geometry, and we'll see how the encoding takes place using one of these models. I explain for one, and it generalizes to other as well. Let's say there is a segment Pi to Pj, which looks like a strand of a sheet. If you are transmitting protein coordinates as segment, the end point of of the previous segment is the start point of the next. So if you are in some stage of the transmission and a segment has been transmitted, the receiver knows Pi, which is the end point of the previous segment, and he is yet to receive this segment corresponding to the current one. If the transmitter has to send this coordinates, so what does he do? He first sends the size of the segment over an integer code, and it's a variable length integer code, and the size turns out to be 6 out here. The receiver receives it, decodes it, then he sends the model type. Now let's say that the transmitter wants to transmit this as a strand model. He sends, so if there are 5 models, it takes log 5 to the base 2 bits, depending upon how many, what your dictionary size is for your ideal models. You assume that they're all uniformly likely, so they're from a uniform distribution, and you can send it in a certain number of bits to the receiver. Then he sends the endpoint Pj using the fact that using the sphere approach that we talked about that for null models, except that the mean of that radius, the radius between that, comes from the model. So he knows the model type. He knows there are 6. The size of the segment is 6, so he basically takes the corresponding model of the ideal model of size 6. The mean would be the distance between the start and end point of that ideal model, and the sigma would be based on the length as well. And he receives the P of j using P of j using the sphere approach that we use for the null model. Then transmitter simply does the following exercise. He places the start point of the ideal model onto the start point of the real segment. There are vectors associated with the start and end point. He aligns these vectors, right? So these vectors are aligned, then he treats that as an axis of rotation and turns the model that minimizes the least square error between the intermediate points. Now the idea is if you choose a wrong model, you're going to have bad fit. Now once he does the rotation, there's a theta associated with the rotation, and the theta is transmitted over a code. Okay, once the theta is transmitted, the receiver can orient the ideal model, which is a part of the code book, on his side. Okay, he knows the ideal model, rotates it by theta, and prepares it in the same orientation that the transmitter has. Then what the transmitter can do is send incrementally the deviations of the real observed coordinates based on with respect to the ideal model, delta x, delta y, delta z for each intermediate point over a probability distribution. Well, there's a lot of technical detail in this work that I'm skimming over. The paper covers those details, but if you want some clarity about it, I'm quite happy to go into the details after the talk. Now, once that deviations are done, the receiver reconstructs. He just adds the deltas to the ideal model to reconstruct the original segment. Now he gets the original segment with respect to the one of the ideal models. Here it happens to be a strand. Now, basically the problem is that you have a protein ordered list of coordinates of proteins that you want to compress losslessly. You have a certain the problem is you can segment the proteins in any number of ways. You can segment the protein in any number of ways, P1 to Pi, Pi to Pj, of different sizes, and each size could be associated with any of the models, coil or the ideal models that we have considered. So the combinatorially very hard problem. So the goal is to find the goal is to find the description, the explanation of these coordinates using a hypothesis that minimizes the entire message of the transmission. Now, so it turns out that you can solve this problem efficiently because optimally using a dynamic programming algorithm. Think about so potentially each pair of points of any model could be a segment. So you construct code lengths for every segment and you define a dynamic program on these segments. The linear ordering constraints there, and I'm not going to explain this thing, but you'll have to trust me that it can be solved optimally, and those are the recursion rules. Now, before getting to the next slide, it turns out, and there's some amount of pre-processing because these ideal models are rigid, straight. So if you have a curved helix, it gets approximated with piecewise models. So you kind of have to collect them back, and there's some amount of post-processing that we do. There's a program that we've written called SST out of this. It's available from the website. That's unfortunately I forgot to print the URL here, but it's in the paper. And as you would do, the first exercise would be to compare with the host of beautiful methods that already exist. There are half a dozen of them. Some of them are very popular in the field. Some of them based on hydrogen bonding patterns, some of them based on local geometry, so different criteria used. If you look at the numbers, this is perhaps the most boring table you'd ever see, because it's one of those secondary structural comparison is a can of worms. You can't basically decide whether one method is better than the other because each method is using an objective, while the general location of the helices agree, where the precise start point and where the precise end point is varies because they're using different criteria. The only justification that we do is we do lossless compression, and there is a mathematically rigorous definition of the problem, and we solve it optimally. So we believe that it's a good restatement, information theoretic restatement of the existing problem. But we had an excellent structural biologist to look at a lot of data that we had. Arthur Lesk is a co-author on this paper. It does what we believe is a decent job of it. We have never felt that we were dissatisfied with the assignment that it does. You could squabble about whether it should be one residue upstream or downstream, and I think that's basically a matter of interpretation. But rather interesting thing is it's a method that assigns secondary structure purely on C alpha coordinates, which means that those methods like DSSP and STRIDE that rely on, let's say, hydrogen bonding patterns for low resolution structures don't have any assignments. So for example, if you have increasingly cryo-EM structures, you kind of have a certain model which only have C alpha coordinates, so you can't assign secondary structure using existing methods. So and what we did, because it's statistically the method, I mean MML, the framework is statistically robust. What we did was we collected structures that are solved at different at low resolution first and superseded by the high resolution, and asked if it's statistically consistent. And we find a lot of consistency between low resolution and high resolution structures. Well, that pretty much ends my talk. As I said, if there are any, I skimmed over a lot of mathematical details, but if you're interested in the mathematics, please do come and see me after the talk. Any questions?
Do you only consider beta sheets and alpha helices as your idealized secondary structures, or do you include some of the other less frequent types of secondary structures?
So we consider precisely left and right-handed types of 310 alpha pi and the strands of sheet and a coil. But what you said is a great question, because in principle this method if you give me a dictionary of fragments, okay, I don't know what fragments are, I can in principle compress a given structure using the dictionary that you give. And this can lead to a subsequent question: what would be the minimal dictionary that you could use, dictionary of fragment substructures that you could use to describe not just one but the entire known structures in the PDB? And we have done that work, and we plan to publish it soon.
Maybe follow up on that. So do you end up getting something like Fragment?
Colloq, I'm sorry, didn't follow. I heard colloq, but what?
Rachel Kolodny developed something called Fragment, an alphabet of structural motions. Do you get something similar to that?
I'm sorry, I must confess I have never heard of that alphabet. I'm sorry, I don't know what you talk about it. Yeah.
Are there more questions?
Excuse me, you classified the secondary structure as helices and beta sheet, but beta sheets have many different types, such as twist or curls. Is your model? Can your model explain that?
The model uses a strand of a sheet, not a sheet itself. Mm-hmm. So what we do in the post process is find. So one of the figure here. It's actually a figure that directly produced by the method. It prints out a PyMol script that you can load. So you can see that the sheets are colored consistently. The method does it for you. And it does it by doing a post process. It does a depth first search on things that are in contact and gathers them. So even if they are twisted, so a twisted strand of a sheet would be represented as a piecewise approximation of linear chunks. So you have a twisted thing by having linear segments, 2 or 3 linear segments approximating it. Now those are first collected into a curved strand of sheet, and then sheets are assembled based on a graph theoretic algorithm to compile them. So that would actually take care of even twists. So there are quite a lot of twists in the figures that you see. And the method does it not implicitly as a model, but as a post process. But you could actually extend the model set by using B-splines, for example. If you can define the axis of a helix and a control point, let's say you're using one control point, and you can say you could use that as a model for transmission, and then and you basically can model curved helices and sheets. In principle it can be done. In this work we haven't. But then we handled it by post-process.
Thank you.
So you'd mentioned that probably besides the lossless compression, the main differentiator between you and other more common methods like DSSP is that you need to use C alpha atoms, and that might be more useful in very low resolution structures. Could you comment on what the usefulness of having some form of secondary structure assignment in these very low resolution structures might actually be, given how fuzzy those sorts of structures really are? And from my personal experience, it was the overall shape of those which seemed to be more useful than being taught from other colleagues that we didn't trust much of the atomic coordinates in structures like that. So
I agree with you. I don't know what to say but to agree with you. The paper contains an assignment on a 10 angstrom cryo-EM structure. Okay. There are two other methods. There's one method called STIX by Willie Taylor, which basically is a method that approximates the folding space using piecewise lines. So you can fit lines to the backbone of C alpha. So we basically could only compare the assignment that we generate with a couple of other methods that can actually cope with that kind of data. The interpretation of whether the assignment is useful or not is something that I don't think I'll be confident to make, except that we have studied low resolution and high resolution of the same structure, and there is a lot of agreement. The table here is basically low resolution versus high resolution, and there is consistency. The hope is that the consistency works even at much lower resolutions as well. Would that answer your question?
I think that was as general as, based on how poor of a question that was to begin with. That sounded very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.